They called it my sister's wedding. I called it my father's downfall. He stood there bragging. The deal's closed. 55 million, and not a cent to her. They laughed. I smiled. Because what he didn't know was that the company he just sold was mine. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash, like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The string quartet played something delicate, soft enough to let the sound of champagne glasses fill the pauses. The ballroom at the Monroe estate shimmered in gold, every chandelier catching the reflections of Lake Forest's autumn light. Cameras flashed near the floral archway, the kind of light that pretends to capture happiness. Everyone looked perfect, rehearsed. I sat at the last table near the back alone, where the waitstaff passed by without meeting my eyes. My dress was simple, black, uninviting. It wasn't the color you wear to your sister's wedding, but I wasn't invited to blend in. Conversations swirled around me. Bits of gossip laughter, the clinking rhythm of ice in glasses. When people noticed me, they did it in whispers. That's her. Someone murmured the middle one, the one who didn't turn out. I could almost laugh. They said it like it was a diagnosis. My father, Richard Monroe, stood at the head table, a man built for rooms like this. Silver hair, tailored tucks, the glow of money and self-belief. He lifted his glass and the noise softened in anticipation. Ladies and gentlemen. He began, his voice amplified just enough to command the room. Tonight isn't just about celebrating love. It's about celebrating legacy. The Monroe name continues. Our family, our business, our success. The crowd applauded, trained to on cue. He smiled that polished smile, scanning the room, as if every face were an investor. Then, his eyes found mine. The pause was brief but sharp. His tone shifted. Warmer for the audience, colder for me. And since we're talking about success, he continued. The deal's closed. $55 million, a new chapter for Monroe Industries. He tilted his glass higher. And not a single cent to her. Laughter broke out like static. Some people tried to hide it behind polite coughs. Others didn't bother. My sister Maddie smirked slightly. Her husband whispering something smug beside her. Chloe, the bride, glanced down, her smile faltering just a fraction before she looked away. My mother kept her eyes fixed on her glass as if the bubbles could distract her from shame. The music faltered, then resumed softer, as though even the musicians weren't sure if they should keep playing. I felt the eyes on me, curious, pitiful, entertained. The familiar heat rose in my chest, not anger exactly, more like recognition. It had always been this way, his victories my humiliation. The price of being his reminder of imperfection. I stood up. The motion alone sliced through the noise. A few heads turned. My chair scraped the floor in a way that sounded deliberate. I picked up my champagne flute. The stem was cold against my fingers. My pulse wasn't. My father's smile stiffened. Alexandra, he said lightly. I didn't expect. I know, I said. My voice carried more than I meant it to, steady and clear. You rarely do. Someone gasped. Someone else laughed nervously. I took a slow step forward, lifting my glass. You raised your glass to your new boss. The sentence hung in the air, suspended like dust in light. For a moment, nobody breathed. Richard's face froze halfway between pride and confusion. A few phones came up recording. Chloe's eyes widened, a flicker of realization dawning too late. I didn't wait for applause, or chaos, or the storm that would follow. I just looked at him. The man who'd taught me everything about power, except how easily it slips away, and I smiled small and precise. And they called it my sister's wedding. I called it the day justice began. The house I grew up in sat on a street lined with oak trees, the kind that framed every family photo like a Hallmark card. Our lawn was trimmed with military precision, the front porch always draped in white lights no matter the season. From the outside, the Monroe family looked like the Midwest dream, successful, polished, unshakable. Inside, everything was staged down to the way my mother laughed on cue. My father, Richard Monroe, was the man magazines loved to feature. The visionary of American industry, Fortune once called him. I remember the photo him in a navy suit, hand on the hood of one of his company's machines. A smile that made you believe he'd built the country himself. My mother, Margaret, stood next to him in the real world, not the photo, always graceful, always quiet. She hosted charity galas and fundraisers wearing pearls like armor. At home, we had assigned roles. Maddie, my older sister, was the crown jewel. Miss Illinois married to rising Senator Thomas Grant. Chloe, the youngest, was our family's social butterfly, sweet, silly, always recording something for her online followers. And me, I was the middle child, the one who didn't fit the brochure. Too quiet, too logical, too different. Dinner at our house was a performance. Every night, the same table set perfectly, the same pattern of conversation. My father would start with work talking about quarterly reports, new contracts, expansion into Canada. Maddie would glide in with stories from Washington, smiling as Thomas texted under the table. Chloe would gush about her latest video, something about skincare or style. I'd wait for a gap, some space to speak. When it finally came, I'd start, "I've been working on a new system for warehouse tracking." My father's fork clinked against his plate. "Let's not make dinner about computers, Alex. Some of us are trying to eat." He said it with a smile that wasn't a smile at all. The table went silent. My mother reached for her wine. Maddie looked down, lips pressed together, and Chloe fiddled with her phone. The air thickened. I remember the way my stomach clenched, the way my throat closed around all the words I'd wanted to say. That's when I learned the rule of our house: silence keeps the peace. He moved on just like that, talking about a new client in Detroit. Everyone pretended nothing had happened. I kept my eyes on my plate, cutting food I couldn't taste. I told myself I'd remember every second of it, not to prove him wrong, but to never forget how it felt to be invisible. I was 16 when I understood how deep invisibility could go. My father threw a party for Maddie's 18th birthday, a full production. Caterers, a live band, the kind of party that made the neighbors peek through their windows. When he handed her the keys to a cherry-red convertible, the crowd cheered. "To my shining star," he said, kissing her cheek. Cameras flashed. It was like watching a commercial for someone else's life. When it was my turn, he gave me a small wrapped box. Everyone leaned in, politely curious. I tore the paper to find a leather-bound notebook. "You like to write, don't you?" he said, chuckling as if he'd just remembered I existed. "Maybe you'll write about all this someday." People laughed softly. I smiled because that's what you do when everyone's watching. The notebook was beautiful, heavy, the pages blank and perfect. I wanted to say thank you, but the words felt wrong. Maddie revved the engine of her new car outside, the music pulsed, and fireworks exploded over the yard. The red light from the sky reflected off the silver watch on my father's wrist. Shiny, flawless, untouchable. I stood at the edge of the party, notebook clutched in both hands, watching him laugh with investors and politicians, watching my mother hover beside him, smiling that tired, pretty smile. I realized then that in our family worth wasn't measured by effort or ideas. It was measured by how you looked under the lights. Later that night in my room, I opened the notebook and wrote one sentence on the first page. "One day they'll see what they chose not to see." I didn't know then how far I'd go to make that happen, but I meant every word. The Monroe Industries Tower looked like it was built to intimidate, 40 floors of steel and glass cutting through the gray Chicago sky. I used to love walking into that building, the hum of the revolving doors, the quiet confidence of people who believed they were building the future. I thought I was one of them. At 24, I worked late every night, convinced my ideas mattered. I told myself I was earning my place. I didn't realize there was no place for me to earn. That morning, the sky was heavy with snow, the kind that muffles sound as if the world is holding its breath. Inside, the boardroom buzzed with low voices and the static of projectors warming up. My father sat at the head of the long glass table, a black folder in front of him, surrounded by men in suits who looked like clones of him. Older, sharper, satisfied. I stood at the screen, hands slightly shaking, trying not to show it. "Our new logistics platform can cut production delays by 40%, I said, pointing to the graphs. "If we integrate predictive tracking, we'll save." "Enough." My father's voice was calm, but final. The kind of tone that shut doors. He leaned back in his chair, lips curved in that familiar, patronizing smile. "We don't experiment, Alexandra. We manufacture. This isn't a classroom." A few chuckles floated across the table. I swallowed hard. "Dad, it's not an experiment. I have the data the test runs." He looked past me to the room. "She still thinks she's playing with computers." The laughter grew low and awkward. My cheeks burned. I could feel my pulse in my throat. "I can prove it." I said, my voice louder than I intended. "Just give me a chance. I don't have time for chances." He closed the folder with a snap. "You're done here." For a moment, I thought I'd misheard him. "What?" "You're terminated. Effective immediately." He didn't even look at me when he said it. The room went silent. Nobody moved. I glanced around, searching for someone, anyone, to speak, but they all avoided my eyes, suddenly busy with their laptops or notes. My father stood signaling the end of the meeting. I stayed frozen in place until the first chair scraped back. I gathered my laptop and a few papers, tucking them into a cardboard box I'd found outside the conference room. No one stopped me. No one said goodbye. The elevator ride down felt endless. The reflection in the mirrored wall looked like a stranger, pale, furious, barely breathing. When the doors opened, I stepped into the lobby. The receptionist gave me that tight, polite smile people use when they don't know what to say. Outside, the cold hit me like a slap. Snowflakes landed on my coat, melting instantly. I stood there on Monroe Plaza, watching the building's lights blink against the gray sky. I thought about every night I'd stayed late, rewriting code under flickering fluorescent lights, believing that if I worked hard enough, he'd finally see me. Recognition was supposed to be my reward. Instead, I got silence and snow. I walked until I couldn't feel my fingers. At the corner, I stopped under a flickering streetlight and looked back. The logo on the building gleamed against the clouds. Monroe Industries. My father's empire. My ghost. I leaned against the cold brick wall of a cafe, opened my laptop, and stared at the code that no longer had a home. For a second, I thought about deleting it all, starting over. Then I heard my own voice in my head, steady and tired. Maybe starting over is the point. The phone in my pocket buzzed. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. Alexandra Monroe. The voice was female, calm, older. "Yes, this is Eleanor Hayes. We haven't met, but I worked with your father for 20 years. There was a pause, until he decided I was replaceable. I didn't answer. I'd heard her name before. His former CFO, the one who'd vanished from the company without explanation. "I saw what happened today," she continued. "I think you're better off. If you still want to build something, come to Boston. I'm putting together a small operation. I could use someone who understands the future better than he does." Snow collected on my sleeves. "Why me?" I asked. "Because you've already learned the most important lesson," she said. "You don't need their permission." The line clicked off. I stared at the screen until it went dark. Around me, the snow kept falling silent, endless. I thought I'd lost everything. But as I stood there watching the city blur into white, I realized I'd just been set free. Boston was colder than I remembered. The kind of cold that gnaws through gloves, turns breath into fog, and makes the city sound hollow. The garage we rented wasn't meant to be an office, but it became one because we had no choice. A cracked concrete floor, one heater that rattled like it was dying, and a folding table that served as our command center. On it sat 3 laptops, a tangle of wires, and 2 coffee mugs that never seemed to empty fast enough. Eleanor worked quietly beside me, her movements deliberate, her eyes sharp even in exhaustion. She was in her late 50s, but her mind was faster than anyone I'd met. "Don't waste time wishing you had more," she told me the first week. "Build with what you've got." I took that literally. My computer was secondhand, the screen flickering every time the heater kicked on. David Harper joined us 2 months later, a financial analyst who'd left a safe job in New York because, as he said, "I'm tired of making other people rich." He was practical, grounded, and almost painfully calm, which balanced the chaos Eleanor and I carried like oxygen. Between the 3 of us, Summit Dynamics was nothing more than caffeine stubbornness, and the belief that we were right. Most nights, I didn't leave. I'd sit hunched over my laptop, fingers stiff, writing line after line of code until my vision blurred. The sound of typing became a heartbeat. Outside, the wind scraped against the metal door, and I wondered if this was what freedom actually sounded like: cold, lonely, relentless. Then came the night everything broke. It was just past midnight. David had gone home. Eleanor was upstairs, sleeping on a cot. I was debugging a line of code when the screen flickered once, twice, then black. I restarted the system, nothing. A red error flashed. Data corrupted. I froze. The entire database, 6 months of development, gone. My chest tightened, the air sharp in my throat. I tried every recovery command I knew, but each line returned the same error, unrecoverable. My hands started to shake. It wasn't just code, it was everything we'd built, everything I had left to prove I wasn't a failure. I leaned back, staring at the blank monitor, until the tears came hot and humiliating. I hadn't cried in years. The garage door creaked open. Eleanor's shadow moved across the floor. She didn't ask what happened. She just stood behind me silent for a moment before placing a hand on my shoulder. Her voice was low, steady. There's no such thing as a final failure, only a test of persistence. I wanted to believe her, but all I could do was whisper, "It's gone." She squeezed my shoulder. "Then start again. If you can rebuild it once, you can rebuild it better." Then she left me there, in the glow of the dead screen. I stayed for 3 days. I lived on vending machine coffee and cold takeout. I rewrote entire modules from memory recompiled code until my fingers cramped. The third morning, as sunlight seeped through the cracks in the metal door, I pressed enter one last time. The monitor blinked, then a message appeared, "Data recovered." I laughed. It sounded like a sob. The blue light from the screen washed over my face, and for the first time in months, I felt alive. That was the moment I realized I didn't need validation. I needed survival. When David came in later, I was still at the computer. He looked at the recovered data and grinned. "You just saved us 6 months, and probably my sanity." I smiled weakly. "Then maybe buy breakfast." 2 weeks later, he walked in holding a printed document, his expression unreadable. "Our first contract," he said. "A logistics company in Ohio. They want to test the software." I took the paper, my hand trembling. The contract wasn't big, but it was real. It meant we existed. Eleanor appeared through the doorway, arms crossed, eyes soft with something close to pride. "Sign it," she said. "Let's make them depend on us." Before they even know we exist, I signed my name. My pen left a small blot of ink on the page. I didn't care. Outside, snow began to fall again, coating the street in white. Inside, the heater rattled on loud and alive. No one in the world knew who we were. That was exactly how I wanted it. By 2016, Summit Dynamics was no longer a dream stitched together with borrowed equipment and sleepless nights. It had become a machine. Quiet, precise, invisible. Our software ran through the veins of half the Midwest, linking factories, shipping centers, and retailers in ways no one else could. If you mapped it out, it would look like a constellation of dependency, hundreds of glowing dots across Illinois, Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, each one pulsing with our code. I stood in front of the digital map one night, the lights reflecting off the glass wall of our Boston office. David leaned beside me, arms crossed, his voice low with something between awe and disbelief. "We're becoming the backbone of the entire industry." I smiled, and no one even knows. It was true. Our contracts were layered through holding companies and intermediaries. Each client thought they were dealing with a different vendor, a small startup offering a specialized solution. None of them knew they were part of a larger network we controlled. That was Eleanor's design. "Control doesn't need attention," she'd said once. "It needs structure." I lived by that. In Indiana, we signed with a major steel manufacturer, our biggest client to date. 2 months later, Michigan followed a chain of auto part distributors falling into place like dominoes. Every deal brought more leverage, more data, more quiet power. Then came the one that made me stop breathing for a moment, a logistics contract from a subsidiary in Illinois. On paper, it was a simple licensing request routed through a procurement firm. But as I skimmed the details, a line at the bottom caught my eye. Parent company Monroe Industries. I froze. The name looked both foreign and familiar, like a ghost written in ink. I read it again, tracing each letter as if they could burn me. Eleanor came in carrying 2 coffees. "You look like you saw a ghost," she said. I turned the laptop toward her. "This?" She squinted, then smirked. Of course. It was bound to happen. The great Richard Monroe buying from a vendor he's never heard of. Delicious, isn't it? David joined us, scanning the file. "You want to take it?" I nodded slowly. "Through an intermediary. He'll never see the name Summit Dynamics." Eleanor set the coffee down, leaning forward. "He'll see the benefit long before he sees the truth. Let him rely on you." Over the next weeks, I signed the deal myself. Every report, every invoice passed through hands that had once ignored mine. Monroe Industries integrated our system into their logistics arm. Within months, their distribution efficiency improved by 23%. I monitored every line of data, every shipment, every algorithm that ran under their logo. David looked over my shoulder one night, his reflection pale in the glow of the monitors. "You know what this means, right?" "I know exactly what it means." He hesitated. "You ever think about calling him just to what?" "Tell him his daughter fixed his mistakes." I laughed, quiet and sharp. He'd find a way to take credit for it. Eleanor overheard us and walked closer, her expression unreadable. "You don't need him to know," she said softly. "You just need him to depend on you." I watched the graphs pulse, showing real-time shipping data from Monroe's plants. Every line of code they used was mine. Every decision they made relied on the system I built. It was better than revenge. It was infiltration. For a while, that was enough. The company grew, our network spread, and the name Summit Dynamics started to appear in places that mattered, quietly, strategically. But then, late one night, my inbox chimed with an unfamiliar address. The subject line read, "Licensing Inquiry." I almost ignored it until I saw the signature block. Richard Monroe, Chairman. Monroe Industries. I opened the email, heart steady but cold. Summit Dynamics. It began. "I've been impressed with the software you developed for our logistics partners. We'd like to discuss a direct licensing agreement for broader integration across our network. Please contact my office to arrange a meeting." He'd written it himself. I could hear his voice in the phrasing, confident, transactional, blind to irony. He had no idea who he was writing to. For a long time, I just stared at the screen. Then slowly, I leaned back and let out a quiet laugh. The glow from the monitor caught the edge of my glass, reflecting in my eyes like firelight. "The game begins," I whispered. Outside, Boston was asleep, its skyline shrouded in fog. Inside, I finally understood what real power felt like. It wasn't loud. It was invisible, and I owned it. Spring had barely settled in when the phone rang. I almost didn't answer. The caller ID said private, which usually meant telemarketers or ghosts from my past. This one turned out to be both. Alex. My mother's voice was softer than I remembered, tremoring at the edges. "It's your mom." It had been years since I'd heard her say my name like that, careful as if she were testing the air first. I sat in my office at Summit Dynamics, the window open to a pale Boston morning. "Hi, Mom," I said quietly. She hesitated before speaking again. "Your father's having problems. The company isn't what it was. He's selling shares, more than he should. He thinks he can save it." The irony was almost beautiful. I leaned back, staring out at the harbor. "And you're calling me because he listens to no one. You might be the only person who can reach him." Her voice cracked, something fragile behind it. "He's not a bad man, Alex. Just proud." I agreed to meet her the following week in Chicago. The cafe she chose was downtown, one of those places that tried to look timeless. Brick walls, jazz playing too low to hear. I saw her before she saw me. She was sitting near the window, clutching her coffee cup, like it might break. The woman who once ran charity galas in pearls now looked smaller, grayer. When she spotted me, she smiled in that careful, apologetic way she used to when my father interrupted me at dinner. "You look good," she said. "Thanks." I slid into the seat across from her. My clothes were simple, but the kind of simple that cost more than it looked. I'd learned that presentation was a language she understood. She reached for her bag, pulling out a stack of papers. "He's talking to investors again. He wants to sell part of Monroe Industries. A big part." I kept my tone even. "To who?" She glanced down at her notes. "A tech company out of Boston. Summit Dynamics, I think it's called." I bit the inside of my cheek to stop the smile. "That's a nice name." She didn't catch the tone. "Richard says it's our only option." "The numbers don't lie, Alex. The company's struggling. Even now," she said as if the empire that erased me still had my name carved somewhere inside it. "Mom," I said gently but firmly, "you should let him make his deals. It's what he's good at." Her eyes searched mine, trying to find the daughter she once recognized. "If you still care about him, please, talk to him. He listens to money, not people. Maybe if you explain—" I cut her off. I can't reason with a man who's made a career out of not listening. Silence settled between us, heavy and awkward. The smell of burnt espresso filled the space. Finally, she sighed. "He loved you in his own way. I laughed softly, not cruelly. Just tired. His love had terms and conditions, Mom. Once I stopped agreeing to them, it expired. She flinched, her hands trembling slightly. For the first time, I noticed how old she looked. Guilt tugged at something inside me, but it was too late for sentiment. I didn't call to fight, she said finally. I called because Chloe's wedding is next month. We'd like you there. We, I echoed. She nodded, fumbling in her purse before handing me a cream-colored envelope. She wanted you to have this. It would mean a lot if you came. Just, please don't make it about business. I took the invitation, turning it over in my hand. The gold edges caught the light, perfect and sterile. I promise I won't make it about business, I said. Then after a pause, but I can't promise I won't finish what he started. She looked at me, confusion flickering across her face. What do you mean, nothing? I said, standing up. Just a thought. Outside, the Chicago wind whipped through the streets, cold even in spring. I walked a few blocks before stopping at an intersection, watching traffic lights change with mechanical precision. I wasn't angry anymore. That surprised me. The rage I'd carried for years had cooled into something quieter, heavier. Emptiness, maybe. Or clarity. When love dies, silence takes its place. I slipped the wedding invitation into my coat pocket. The paper felt too delicate for what it represented. I'll be there. I whispered to no one, the words lost in the wind. But this time I'm not showing up to watch. I'm showing up to end it. And with that, I crossed the street toward the train station, the skyline of Chicago glowing behind me. Like a ghost, I was finally ready to confront. The office was lit only by the glow of the monitors, the blue light cutting across the glass table like water. Boston slept outside, but inside Summit Dynamics, the hum of machines never stopped. David stood beside me, scrolling through the financial report that Evelyn Carter had just dropped on our desk. She sat across from us, her hands steady, her expression made of steel. I found it, she said, sliding a thick folder toward me. Kyle Anderson set up a shell company in Delaware last year. It's been siphoning money from Monroe's vendor contracts for months. 3.2 million, maybe more. I flipped through the pages, scanning the numbers, the paper cool under my fingertips. It was all there. Dummy accounts, false invoices, names that didn't exist. My pulse didn't quicken. It slowed. Don't stop him, I said finally. Evelyn frowned. Excuse me. Let him keep going, I said, closing the folder. The more he takes, the deeper the trail. When he finally falls, it'll bury everyone who trusted him. David gave me a look, part admiration, part worry. You're playing with fire, Alex. I'm holding the extinguisher, I replied. My father used to say that power was control, steady hands, predictable outcomes. But I learned something he never did. Real power was letting other people build their own traps and waiting for the click. A week later, Evelyn called me late at night. Her voice was tight. Someone's following me. Where are you downtown? I think it's one of Kyle's people. I got an email. No sender address. It said, stop digging or lose everything. I grabbed my coat and keys. Book a room near the harbor, under another name. I'll meet you in an hour. When I arrived, the hallway smelled of sea salt and old carpet. Evelyn opened the door, her face pale, her laptop still open on the bed. The glow from the screen made the shadows sharper. He's scared, I said, locking the door behind me. I should report it, she muttered. But if they trace the leak back to me, they won't. I sat down across from her. Listen, I've been where you are. I lost everything once because a man thought I'd never fight back. They don't fear women like us because they think we're weak. They fear the day they realize we're smarter. Her eyes met mine, steadying. The silence between us wasn't fear, it was agreement. I pulled a document from my bag and slid it toward her. This gives you full legal protection under Summit's corporate umbrella. If anyone comes after you, they're coming after me. Evelyn hesitated. That's risky for you. I smiled faintly. It's not risk, it's insurance. She signed. I took the folder, scanned the last page, and emailed a digital copy to our attorney. Then I forwarded the full report, every number, every fake invoice, to a contact in the Federal Financial Crimes Unit, anonymous tip. I said, hitting send. The next morning, the story broke quietly. Just a headline buried deep in a financial feed, regulators launch inquiry into Monroe Industries subsidiary. By afternoon, it spread. Kyle's Delaware company was flagged for audit. Monroe's internal finance department went into lockdown. My father had no idea where the storm had come from. David came into my office, phone in hand. They're panicking, he said. The board's in emergency session. I nodded, watching the city below shimmer with sunlight. Good, let them sweat. He looked at me for a long moment. You know, sometimes you scare me. I smiled, turning back to the window. That means it's working. Outside the harbor was calm, the waves steady against the pier. Inside the machine I built kept running, every piece moving exactly as planned. My father taught me that control was everything. He was wrong. The art was in letting go, just enough to watch them destroy themselves. The ballroom in deep glittered like a gold coin under too many lights. Cameras flashed every few seconds. Reporters leaned over velvet ropes shouting names, and the orchestra played something upbeat enough to drown the murmurs of politics. Maddie Grant stood near the podium beside her husband, Senator Thomas Grant, smiling the way she'd practiced for years. Smile, nod, shimmer. Her gown caught the light, but her eyes didn't. I saw the footage later on TV, but I could tell what she was feeling even through the screen. Exhaustion disguised as elegance. The Grants had built their reputation on the illusion of unity, and in that room full of donors, her face was a mask of composure, about to crack. When the cameras stopped flashing, Thomas leaned close enough that the microphones wouldn't catch his voice. If the Monroe scandal blows up, I'm not going down with you. She blinked, the smile freezing in place. What are you talking about? He adjusted his cufflinks, the picture of calm ambition. Your father's company is under investigation. If this turns public, I'll have to distance myself. Her laugh was brittle. You mean distance yourself from me? He didn't deny it. I mean stay clean. You should do the same. She swallowed hard, holding her breath until the next flash went off. When she exhaled, her hands trembled. You promised we were a team. He turned away, already scanning the room for someone more useful. Politics doesn't run on promises, Maddie. The cameras turned back on. He smiled, perfect again. She smiled too, her eyes glassy, her lipstick flawless. In Boston, the TV light flickered across my office walls as the footage replayed. David was pacing behind me, phone in hand. Thomas is already sweating. If he falls, Monroe loses its last ally in Washington. I didn't look away from the screen. They'll take themselves down. We just have to give gravity a nudge. On my desk lay the folder Evelyn had built. The one full of Kyle's shell company transactions, his secret accounts, and the signatures that connected him to Monroe Industries. I opened it, flipping to the page with the Delaware registration. Mark Benson, I said. David looked up. The journalist. I nodded. He's been chasing this story for months. He thinks he's following money laundering through regional manufacturers. Let's give him something real. David hesitated. You're going to leak internal documents. Not leak, I said. Illuminate. I scanned the files, stripped the metadata, and uploaded only what I needed him to see: the trail from Kyle's company to Monroe's accounts, and a few breadcrumbs pointing toward the Grants' private holdings. Within 24 hours, Mark replied, This can't be real. Where did this come from? Follow the wire transfers, I wrote back. The truth's been sitting in plain sight. 2 days later, an email alert woke me at dawn. Summit Holdings identified as shadow investor in Monroe Industries merger. I smiled, sipping coffee as the headlines multiplied. Voiceover. In this game, I didn't need to strike. I only had to pull one thread and let them watch the web collapse. By the weekend, every major news outlet had picked up the story. The perfect family deal, the Chicago Tribune called it. The cover photo showed my father shaking hands with a corporate partner, Thomas Grant, smiling in the background. The article laid it all out. How Monroe's business empire overlapped with his son-in-law's campaign funding. How shell companies connected the two families in ways that looked too strategic to be coincidence. In Washington, Maddie woke up to flashing cameras outside her townhouse. Thomas refused to open the door. By noon, his staff released a statement Senator Grant had no knowledge of his in-laws' financial affairs. Maddie called my mother in tears. I knew because Margaret left me a voicemail, her voice shaking. Whatever you're doing, Alex, please stop. You're destroying us. But I hadn't destroyed anything. I'd just lit the room so everyone else could see. At Monroe Industries, my father's rage shook the walls. He threw a phone against the window, the glass cracking but not breaking. Someone's behind this, he barked to his board. Somebody inside wants to watch me burn. He wasn't wrong. That night, I sat in my apartment overlooking the Boston skyline, the city lights scattering like static. David called from his office. He's losing control. The board's considering suspending all outside contracts. Good, I said softly. The more he panics, the more mistakes he makes. There was a pause on the line. You think they'll connect it to us? I smiled, watching my reflection fade into the window. Not yet. To them, Summit Dynamics is just another faceless partner. That's the beauty of invisibility. Down below, the harbor glimmered under the streetlights, calm and unbothered. Somewhere in Chicago, my father was pacing the length of his empire, trying to find the crack in the glass. He'd built his world on control, on certainty, on the illusion that no one could outthink him. And now, for the first time, he was surrounded by mirrors he couldn't recognize. The newspaper on my desk rustled in the breeze from the open window. The Perfect Family Deal in bold black print. I closed it and leaned back, letting the silence settle. The war had started, but he still thought it was business. That was his first mistake. It would not be his last. Autumn arrived early that year in Lake Forest. The air was sharp and clean, the sky too bright, as if it knew what was about to happen and wanted a front row seat. The Monroe estate looked like something out of a magazine spread. White tents stretched over the lawn, crystal chandeliers hanging from beams, photographers elbowing for angles. It wasn't just a wedding. It was a broadcast of power, a performance for people who'd spent their lives pretending to matter. I parked 2 streets away and walked the last half-mile. The click of my heels against the stone path echoed more than I wanted it to. My dress was navy, almost black, the kind that didn't blend with champagne tones and flower arrangements. Heads turned as I entered. Someone whispered, "She actually came." Another voice, quieter but crueler, added, "Doesn't she know when to stop embarrassing herself?" I didn't flinch. I'd grown up being the conversation no one said aloud. Inside, the hall was buzzing with rehearsed laughter. Maddie stood near the front, her expression tight behind perfect makeup. My mother lingered by the aisle, giving instructions to planners as if control could hide nerves. And then there was my father, Richard Monroe, standing by the stage, shaking hands, his tuxedo flawless, his smile sharp enough to cut glass. He was in his element, the center of every room, the man people turned toward without realizing why. I found a seat near the back. No one joined me. That suited me fine. I watched Chloe float through the entrance in a cloud of white lace, all sweetness and innocence. When her eyes met mine, surprise flickered, confusion, maybe fear, but she didn't look away. Not yet. The ceremony was quick, mechanical. Every vow rehearsed, every smile held a beat too long. As the applause began, Richard stepped up to the microphone. The crowd quieted instantly. He was about to give his favorite speech, the one about legacy. Tonight, he began, voice steady, confident. We celebrate not just love, but success. Family, fortune, and the future. The crowd murmured approval. Today marks a new chapter for Monroe Industries as well. The deal's closed. $55 million, a landmark sale for our company. He paused, scanning the crowd with theatrical precision, until his gaze landed on me. A smirk crept into his voice, and not a single cent to her. It landed like a slap. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the laughter started, hesitant at first, then rolling like waves. Someone near the front snorted. Maddie pressed her lips together, a smile that wasn't one. My mother looked down at the floor. Chloe's bouquet trembled in her hands. I didn't move right away. I let the moment stretch, the sound of their laughter wrapping around me, heavy and familiar. It was the same laugh that had followed me out of his boardroom all those years ago, when he'd fired me for thinking too much. But this time I wasn't the one leaving. I rose slowly. The movement was enough to silence the nearest tables. I picked up my glass, the stem catching the light, and stepped forward just enough to be seen. "Dad," I said, voice calm, clear. "You should be careful who you toast." His brows knit, irritation flashing before he smoothed it over. "Alexandra, this isn't the time." "It's exactly the time." I took another step forward. "You raised your glass to your new boss." The words dropped into the room like stones. For a second, nothing happened. Then, one by one, heads turned from him to me. The laughter died mid-breath. Chloe's hand went to her mouth. The string quartet stopped playing. Even the lights seemed to hum quieter. My father stared, blinking once, twice. "What did you say?" I didn't repeat myself. I didn't need to. I just looked at him. The man who'd spent his life underestimating me, who'd built an empire on control, and let him see that control crumble. The silence stretched. Somewhere near the back, a photographer's flash went off, freezing us in light. Glass clinked as someone set their drink down too hard. The air itself felt suspended, waiting for gravity to remember what to do. I smiled just enough for him to see it. "Congratulations," I said softly. "It's quite a deal." Then I sat back down, leaving him standing there, the microphone still in his hand, his reflection flickering in the gold-trimmed glasses scattered across the tables. The laughter was gone now, replaced by something else, recognition. They didn't know yet what I'd done, not really. But they would, and by the time the night was over, every flash, every whisper, every pair of eyes in that room would belong to me. The silence lasted so long, it stopped feeling like silence. It felt like pressure. Every set of eyes in the ballroom pinned to me, waiting for a punchline that would never come. My father still stood at the microphone, his smile stiff, his hand gripping the stem of his glass so tightly, his knuckles turned white. I walked toward the stage, the echo of my heels sharp against the marble floor. The screen behind him flickered, waiting. I reached the podium and took the remote from his hand without asking. "You've made a big announcement tonight," I said, my voice steady. "But you forgot one small detail." I clicked the button. The projector hummed and the first slide appeared. Acquisition agreement. Monroe Industries. Summit Dynamics. The logo of his company stood side by side with mine. The crowd gasped. My father turned to look at the screen, confusion flickering across his face before anger took its place. "What is this supposed to be?" "You don't know who bought your company, do you?" I asked almost gently. A voice came from the back of the room. "I do." Eleanor Hayes walked down the aisle, her posture regal, her expression composed. She stopped beside me and faced the crowd. "I'm the representative for Summit Dynamics," she said, clear and calm. "And the CEO you've all been talking about," she turned toward me, "is her." A shock ran through the room like a current. The whispers started first, then the clicking of cameras. Someone gasped my name. Maddie covered her mouth, tears forming, while Thomas stepped away from her, his face pale. My father blinked, still trying to piece it together. "You're joking." "No," I said. "I bought you out. Every factory, every license, every asset you thought you controlled. You signed the papers yourself." The screen changed again this time, showing his signature on the final page of the acquisition contract. Beneath it, the Summit logo glowed like a signature of its own. The audience murmured. I could hear their disbelief mixing with fascination. And then the next slide appeared. Bank records routing numbers, company names. "But that's not all," I said. "Here's your new son-in-law's contribution to the Monroe legacy." The room filled with whispers. Kyle Anderson took a step back, his face draining of color. The projection showed transfers from a shell company in Delaware looping through Monroe Industries' accounts. His name sat beside every digital signature. "This is absurd," Kyle shouted. "You can't prove any of that." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "You already did, Mr. Anderson. You signed it," Maddie sobbed, turning away. Chloe's bouquet slipped from her hands and hit the floor with a dull thud. My mother took a step forward, her voice small. "Alex, please," my father's voice cut through hers. "This is a scam," he barked. "You forged this. You think you can humiliate me in my own house?" I turned to face him. "No, this isn't humiliation. This is consequence." For a heartbeat, the room was completely still. Even the camera crews had stopped moving. Then, near the back, Mark Benson lifted his phone, sending a signal. The news crew outside received it instantly. The live broadcast began silent but steady, capturing everything. The guests began to file out quietly, pretending they hadn't come to watch a spectacle. I watched them go. All those people who had smiled at my father for years, now avoiding his eyes. Richard Monroe was shaking now, his voice breaking under the weight of fury. "You think this makes you powerful? You'll regret this. You'll regret crossing me." Eleanor stepped closer, her tone almost kind. "You told me once that women don't understand business," she said. "Maybe you were wrong." He slammed his glass down on the table. The crystal shattered, scattering shards across the floor. The sound rang through the hall, sharp as thunder. For the first time in my life, I didn't look away. He turned toward me again, chest heaving. "You wanted my attention," he said. "Well, you have it." I met his eyes. "I don't need it anymore." The cameras kept rolling. The lights flickered. Outside, the autumn wind picked up, carrying with it the faint sound of reporters shouting questions into microphones. Inside, the king had fallen silent, surrounded by the ruins of his own celebration. The night wasn't over yet, but the truth was, The news hit like a thunderclap. Every outlet, every channel, every feed carried the same headline: the daughter who secretly bought her father's company. They ran the story on repeat, clips of the wedding, the screen flashing behind me the moment my father froze. The press turned it into legend before the dust even settled. In less than a week, Monroe Industries became a case study in hubris. The board called an emergency vote and stripped Richard Monroe of his executive authority. He still had shares, but no power. The markets punished the name. Stock value fell overnight, clients withdrew partnerships, dissolved. The empire he'd built on pride and control crumbled faster than anyone thought possible. Maddie's world fell apart next. Her husband, Senator Grant, released a statement announcing their mutual separation. She didn't even get to write the word divorce herself. The media replayed footage of her crying in a car, while reporters shouted questions about family corruption. The headline read, "From Miss Illinois to Mrs. Scandal." Chloe's marriage ended before it began. Her fiancé disappeared for a week, then lawyers arrived to announce the engagement had been voided. She issued a short post online. One photo of her ring on a countertop captioned only, "Starting over." My mother, Margaret, did what she always did. Disappeared into silence. No statements, no interviews. Just a note left with the family publicist. "Please respect our privacy." Her absence became its own story. And then there was my father. Someone sent me a photo from a local journalist. Him sitting alone in the empty Monroe Industries boardroom, his suit slightly undone, a glass of whiskey half full beside him. He was staring at an old framed family photo. The four of us smiling on a Christmas years ago. The caption under the image read, "The cost of legacy." The requests started coming in almost immediately. Morning shows wanted interviews. Business magazines offered cover features. How she outsmarted the system. The rise of Summit Dynamics. Daughter of industry or architect of revenge. I turned them all down. David handled the calls. "She's unavailable," he'd say. "She's focused on work," Eleanor teased me once. "You're the only CEO I know who hates publicity more than failure." I smiled. I don't need to be praised. I just want peace. But peace wasn't what the world wanted from me. They wanted a symbol, a soundbite, a story they could package. I wasn't a story. I was what came after. It was late one evening when the receptionist called up to my office. "There's someone here to see you," she said. "He doesn't have an appointment." I already knew who it was. Richard Monroe stood in the lobby of Summit Dynamics, smaller somehow. He looked around, his reflection caught in the polished glass surrounded by the quiet hum of my company. For a long moment he didn't speak. Then he said softly, "You've done well for yourself." I nodded. "You taught me how." He gave a small, humorless laugh. "I didn't teach you this." I looked out the window, watching the city lights shimmer over the harbor. "Maybe not. But you taught me what not to become." He took a step closer. "You won." I turned to face him. "No," I said. "I just stopped losing." For a second his expression wavered. Something like recognition or maybe regret. He nodded once slow and turned to leave. His reflection lingered in the glass long after he was gone. When the elevator doors closed behind him, I didn't feel satisfaction. Just stillness. Sometimes justice doesn't come from a courtroom or a confession. Sometimes it comes from the silence that follows when the person who tried to bury you has to look up to see where you're standing. Outside, the city kept moving, people rushing to catch trains, taxis, honking life continuing, as if none of this had ever mattered. On the screen behind me, the financial news anchor was announcing it. Richard Monroe officially resigned from all remaining board positions. Across the ticker, another headline scrolled, "Eleanor Hayes, named Industries Pioneer of the Year for advancing women in leadership." I smiled faintly at the irony. The man who once said women didn't belong at the table had been replaced by two who now owned the room. And in that quiet, I finally felt the weight lift. Not triumph, not revenge, just release. Morning crept in, slow and silver, the kind of Boston morning that made the harbor look like glass. The city was still waking, the skyline veiled in mist. I stood by the window of my office, the air faintly cold against the glass. For the first time in months, there were no calls, no breaking headlines, no fires to put out. Just the hum of the building and the distant sound of gulls. Behind me, the door opened softly. Eleanor walked in carrying 2 cups of coffee. She set one beside me. "You're in early," she said. "Couldn't sleep," I admitted. She joined me at the window, eyes following the ships moving in slow arcs across the water. So she said after a pause, "How does it feel?" "Taking it all back." I smiled faintly, not looking at her. "I didn't take it back. I just took what should have been mine, all along." Eleanor nodded, a proud, quiet smile crossing her face. "He used to say women didn't belong at that table," she murmured. "And now we own the building." We both laughed softly. The kind of laugh that isn't joy exactly, more like peace finally catching up to you. I turned back to my desk and opened my laptop. The morning emails waited like sentinels, but one subject line caught my eye. "Case closed." It was from Evelyn. Her message was short. "Summit Dynamics has officially won. The court dismissed all counterclaims. I've been reinstated, and the board issued a public apology. Thank you. For everything." I stared at the words for a long time, not because they surprised me, but because they didn't. The truth had done what truth always does. It surfaced quiet and undeniable. I leaned back, exhaling. "Evelyn's case is over," I said. "We won." Eleanor smiled knowingly. "Of course we did. You were never fighting for revenge, Alex. You were fighting to make sure the story ended differently this time." I didn't answer right away. I looked at the city again, the same city that once felt too big, too untouchable. Now it just looked human, manageable. Ours. Down the hall, I heard the faint buzz of conversation as my team started to arrive. Laughter mixed with the sound of coffee machines and shuffling papers. It was ordinary. It was perfect. Eleanor glanced at her watch. "You've got a meeting in 5. They're waiting." I nodded and closed my laptop. The Summit Dynamics logo pulsed on the screen for a second before fading to black. Across the wall outside the conference room hung a new banner. Summit Dynamics. Power through precision. It wasn't flashy, just simple truth. The kind that lasts. When I stepped into the room, everyone stood automatically. Their faces were expectant proud. Some of them had no idea what I'd done to build this. Maybe they didn't need to. What mattered was that we were here now, building something that would outlive the noise that came before. "Good morning," I said quietly. The chatter stopped. I took my seat at the head of the table. "Let's begin." As the meeting started, my eyes drifted to the window again. Outside, the city shimmered in the light. Boston, awake, steady, alive. The reflection of our conference room glimmered faintly against the glass. A woman standing where she was never meant to stand, surrounded by people who believed in her. That was enough. Sometimes justice doesn't need a fight. Sometimes it just needs time and silence to finish the job, because I didn't need anyone to apologize. The truth had already done it for them. If you've ever had your voice taken away, remember this silence isn't weakness. It's power waiting to be heard. And when the time comes, you won't have to shout to be understood. You'll just have to stand.